That was fantastic opening. And yes, I am incapacitated a little bit at the minute. While coming here to Singapore, I took a trip to Siberia, hooked up with Vladimir Putin, and we went bear hunting. Didn't go very well for me. Got caught in a bear trap, so you can see I'm suffering right now. If you can believe that, if you want. The other story is I went out Saturday night and rolled my ankle when coming home, so that's probably a better story. Yes, so this is the first panel of the day, probably one of those critical ones because we are at a really interesting juncture in the history of this industry. We are probably on the cusp of the death of the third-party cookie through various legislation in Europe, like GDPR, and some legislation coming in the US, but also the platforms, the browsers, particularly Firefox and Apple, have been pushing their ITP user privacy piece very aggressively. And at the minute, Safari basically makes it a dead zone for third-party cookies. So this is a huge issue at the minute. And we as an industry need to figure this out because third-party cookies are so important for many, many things. It's a framework for everything we do in this industry, from tracking, from measurement, frequency capping. These are like basic things that we do with the third-party cookie that will not be possible probably in 12 months. So we're here today to talk about where we are, what we can do. So I want to start off with the panel first and ask about what the identity strategy should be going forward, because we must plan for this type of thing. So let's start with that. What is your identity strategy? Who wants to kick that off?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, happy to take a first stab at this. So from an identity standpoint, I think we probably first have to think about how we view identity. For me, I think the view of identity is to understand as much as we can about the user, to build and bridge a better relationship between the advertiser and the consumer. And with that in mind, it's to think about what are the opportunities that we have in our data environment today that we can leverage, and then what are the kind of new limitations around how we then leverage these data opportunities. So for example, before I'd say we'd have tons of browsing behavior data that we look at, purchase history, very cookie-based data, like Kieran mentioned. In the last couple of years, that's definitely evolved to include a lot of what we've determined as offline, but has now become online. And so that's your outdoor, that's your radio, that's your out-of-home, TV. So how do we bridge that as an opportunity and include it into our profile of our consumer? The other angle is obviously how do we then balance that with the limitations of governmental legislation, browser behaviors, all changing because of their kind of view on what the cookie should play. So I think with that in mind, we have to think about identity in that kind of angle first, and what kinds of cards we have to play with in today's environment.
From my perspective, I think the first-party data strategy, what we are currently using, is kind of a flawed, because primarily we are using cookies and mapping with all the entire ad tech solution, which is resulting in a lot of data loss. I think as an industry, we need to create a common solution, which will help the entire ad tech industry in the value exchange, and hence it drives efficiency and effectiveness to both advertisers as well.
I think from our standpoint, when we speak identity, it's literally the context and the compliance. I think these are the two words that kind of define how identity is going to be formed. Globally speaking, in the America, we have over 220 million users mapped, and that's under a platform that's proprietary to us. It has many different attributes, but when you bring that similar foundation and setup to other parts of the world, you see that there are challenges. So in Europe, there is GDPR. We're talking about Asia Pacific. I think device IDs is typically what we look at in terms of forming the basis. The way it's being done is you have second-party partnerships, but the challenge there is ensuring that there is a long-term healthy relationship with a certain publisher, because that's where you get challenged by scale. So in terms of fundamental of what you see as identity, typically cookies and device IDs, because you have other restrictions. But what are the typical challenges? And what we would see is typically scale. Or otherwise, in terms of clients which are matured, we would definitely go by advising a few technology platforms and then utilizing the first-party data in terms of forming that identity. Bit of use of the customer data platform in the light way rather than going a heavy TMP.
I think that's a good segue for us. So I come from Coke. I've been on the other side as well from a tech world, being part of DSPs and then moving on to Coke. One of the major things from a Coca-Cola standpoint right now is first party is key. I mean, I think first party insourcing, or rather the importance to look at growing that scale, having that direct relations with consumers, that's on the raise for sure. But what's also important is, in terms of in-housing the whole technology solution, right? It's very easy for us to outsource identity to somebody else and then later on realize we are hooked onto just that outlet. It's important to own, as Sunil mentioned, the mobile device IDs is one key part of our strategy here locally, because that subverts the whole cookie sync problems. But that's just a start. Looking at the major alliances coming up, Trade Desk Unified ID, and all the other alliances that are coming up, that's the more exciting part for us. And that's where we want to invest strategically. And I'm pretty sure with all the privacy regulations in place, we need to figure out a unified solution across the whole landscape. That's where the independent market can really survive, right? Otherwise, it's going to be status quo with all the walled gardens. So yeah.
Do you think that single ID is possible? I mean, it's still sort of based on a third cookie premise, and I agree to the mobile device thing is important, but there is talk within Apple that they're thinking of getting rid of the IDFA, so that could be the first step to that. So.
In my mind, it's a bit of juggling of multiple balls in the air. A lot of things can go wrong with some of the balls, especially with Apple taking that effort. So in my mind, we have to progress on multiple directions. Internally in Coke, we have to figure out our own deterministic ID solution that doesn't just remain a market-based solution, but cuts across the global markets that we have. And that's an effort that we are doing right now. But in parallel to that, should we also consider, not just limiting ourselves to the mobile ID, but hedge ourselves with multiple cookie alliances? I know there's not going to be a single ID that can cover things, but is there a potential to at least start with some of those relations? That's probably our approach right now, because the future as it is, it's very questionable, right? I mean, we don't know which way the whole industry will go in a couple of years. But at the very least, we need to progress in a few different directions and see, at least we are ahead of the curve in multiple directions.
Yeah, sorry. I think, now we are seeing third-party cookies are blocked. That's stage one. I strongly believe maybe 2 years down the line, there might be another version of ITP coming on mobile.
Yeah, it's likely, because if you can follow the logic of legislators and some of these companies, that if they start with the browser, they will continue into mobile. Because I don't know if you've seen this, but the ICO in the UK, which is the data protection agency, they issued a report there, and they were saying that textual segmentation could be classed as a breach of privacy. So, that was the fallback for a lot of people going, oh yeah, if behavioral goes away, we still have contextual, but even that is potentially in the mix as well. So, the question is, are we heading towards a world where we nearly have to authenticate and get the buy-in from every user to allow them to be targeted by ads?
I think we should. I think we will. I think that's why it is consent-based, either cookie or device ID, whatever it is. Consent-based device ID is really important, and it is not. It's very hard for one publisher, one agency, or one advertiser to build this pool of data. That's why we need a common technology. Publishers, everybody need to come together to address this issue, and I think that's the reason I feel it's a great idea having a unified ID, which could be shared across multiple ad vendors. And it gives enormous effectiveness for the marketers, also efficiency in terms of buying audience or reaching audience.
Because it's the point, like you've got all these walled gardens, right? So your frequency capping goes out the window when you've got Amazon, Google, Facebook, and whoever else, Grab, whoever. But then that comes a thing for the other part of the web as well. We won't be able to do any proper frequency capping.
I think what's really happening is you have an Amazon ID, a Facebook ID, a Google ID, and now we saw the Ozone Project, right? And what typically we remember as the one line of the Ozone Project is that
So
it beats the scale of Facebook.
The Ozone Project as the UK Ozone Project.
It's UK, right?
Yeah. So this is a collective of publishers in the UK who are trying to solve the ID problem. The Guardian, Telegraph, and the Times, I believe.
Right. And what's happening? Say, supposedly we are able to solve the single ID problem. What's next is then the measurement across, and then what's next is the effectiveness of those ads, right? So, I mean, if I look at it 2 years down the line, we're going to be having a discussion that okay, now we have the single ID, but the accountability lies with the advertiser, with the agency on driving effectiveness, to the publisher on driving good content. Yep. So where is the effectiveness of the campaign lie? And then that's for the future. But I think essentially what's happening is that the single ID, the formation will have different meanings, and generally we see our clients own that in their own smaller universe. And if we're not coming together as an industry, I think the fight is against the walled gardens. So if you don't come together as an industry, I think it's going to be more acquisitions or more companies perishing very, very soon.
And I probably summarize it into probably two huge challenges that we see. One is in terms of the data that we have access to today, whether it's cookie data or mobile device ID data, and what happens to that later, I think we just need to be, responsive to it and be ready to perhaps move towards a cookieless world. But keeping in mind that we still have tons of data that we can sit on and that we can parse and try to make sense of. I think the other angle that we challenge ourselves with is there's a lot of talk about a single ID, and there's a lot of efforts being put into us trying to make sense into creating a single profile of users within our purview. However, we're still not talking to each other as much as we should. And you mentioned there are alliances like the Trade Desk Unified ID, there's the Advertising ID Consortium, but I think out in APAC especially, nobody has really tapped into it. Nobody has really had the kind of next level conversation to bring that conversation together so that we can all collectively identify a user under the same definitions as we should. So, I think with all of us in the room today, I think that's probably my key message out is how do we collectively build towards a single ID so that we can all, whether it's to combat a Facebook or a Google, or at least just understand our user better in the context of advertising today.
So is that first step then a single sign-on? We did an event in Germany, and there's a leading sort of player there called NetID, and it's all based around the email, but there's 10 other companies trying to build a single sign-on for Germany. So there's 11 companies right now battling to win like the single sign-on for a market of 70 million people. So, but it does seem like they're moving towards that solution. Do you think that is a good start?
Yeah. So there are multiple ways to look at this, right? Just getting single sign-on across all of the Coke markets is a challenge by itself, right? But we are talking about the whole wide world. The way I see it, it has to be flipped around in terms of consumer's perspective, right? If I'm a consumer, I don't necessarily want to log in, even if it's a single sign-on. I don't really care. What I want is more transparency and easy ways to access data. Whether the person collecting the data whether it's a data controller or a data processor, I need to know what exactly everybody has on me. I feel like that's the way things are moving forward. One of my big hesitances in using some of the platforms has been the same, right? So if that is the case, whether it's a single ID or multiple versions of IDs, the fundamental thing here is the whole revolution with GDPR, CCPA, all of these things, it's actually for the good of the industry. the ones who get ahead of this curve, and this includes everybody, right? I mean, from an advertiser standpoint, from a publisher standpoint, from a programmatic channel perspective, everybody needs to think about that, because the quicker we get to that, whether it's a singular ID or multiple IDs, that will become more trusted. I think having a trusted ID, especially with consumers, that's where it's going to be the key. I mean, even for Google and Facebook, that's the problem that we are going to face very soon, right? Facebook is probably questionably challenged quite a few times on that front. How do we answer this question? So that is something that we are trying to do with Cook, right? How do we easily give access to people's data, what we understand of them, what decisions we make of them. Everything needs to be consent-driven, but everything also needs to be accessible, not like, you call a number and 5 days later you get some report. That's not going to work. So that would be my perspective, looking at it from a consumer's angle, and then thinking about what is the right solution.
So that's a good point. Facebook have kind of tapped out on the inventory they have within their own ecosystem, and their Facebook ad network is growing at a clip. So, but to work outside of Facebook, they still have the same problems we have, right? On the open web, you still need a cookie to make that work, as is Google, as is Amazon. So maybe there is a need for us to have a collective conversation, say, look, let's work off one single consented ID, so everybody can work off it. And that is sort of a possible solution.
Well, I think if you look at Facebook, 2016, they stopped the FBX because they didn't want to exchange that data. And what they said is that I'm going to enter the publisher world and throw more ads in the wider ecosystem while keeping my turf off the newsfeed. Now, if you talk about the pixel usage of Facebook, that's pretty much done by every publisher. And that's more like a one-way street for me. But I think asking 1,000 publishers that make up 15% of the pie to come together to fight against the two walled gardens, probably we need to do that. But I mean, it's going to be a massive, massive effort, and I think we'll have to keep our own interests aside, because for an ad tech company, it's charging for the tech and the talent to build that. For a publisher, it's about trying to do the subscription models now so that they can make that money.
But not everybody's going to pay for subscriptions,
And that's what we've been seeing. And every other logo that you saw there is typically apps on mobile that's going to get scale of the users, where you don't have, all of these are unique propositions. TikTok is unique. Facebook is in a way unique. Pinterest is unique. When we talk about publications, how many of them are unique? And that's where the challenge of scale comes in. So every intent is there. I think we have the intent, but it's just about the practicality, and then the reality, the commercials come in, and the appetite of running the long race.
Is there a fear here that we might end up with 15,000 different IDs, and then the whole idea of how you market, like digital, just goes out the window?
We could, but then thinking practically from a buyer standpoint, you might stick to the 2 or 3, and you might have 20,000 out there, but it's just not going to make any sense in that sense. So I think what's really important probably at this stage is we know Apple has changed the way. So even to your point on single sign-on, with Apple, I think the ID that the login that you sign in with gets masked. So you don't even actually get the single sign-on now. So what happens is talking about the 85% of the browser world, typically, if the advertiser advances its own technology and has scale and has multiple digital interactions with the consumer, then they could scale faster than talking about typically advertisers in the auto space or the CPG space where those interactions are less. And then we go into D2C, where Googles of the world and the Facebook of the world are now doing measurement practices with Lazada to ensure that they can give value to the FMCG guys, because that's where the digital interaction and purchase is happening. So I think it's probably needs a bit more thought and coming together and keeping the self-interest away if you really need to move the needle. Because as you said, 15,000 IDs may exist, but I don't know the practicality of that.
I don't think it's practical at all.
I think we already have 15,000 IDs now. Yeah. Typically, I mean, there are so many, more than 15,000 vendors are giving a lot of IDs. Everyone is claiming they have scale, they have very good probabilistic models, and combined with deterministic data, and they say 80% measured with Nielsen, but still, if you see, when you do actual campaign, there's a huge loss of data.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is, to Vidarth's point earlier, there's new models evolving as well. So I recently spoke to a company a couple of weeks ago where it's a consumer-led opt-in model. So you basically get paid, like everyone in this room can actually go download the app, and you get paid on two levels. One level is you basically provide your own data. Obviously, the more sensitive it is, it's probably more valuable, and you get paid out on that. Second level, whereby you get monetized, is when your data is being used, and there's a rev share coming back to you. That's where you then get some kind of reward for the usage of that data as well. So there's scale. You're kind of involved as part of the share of the monetization that comes out of it, and that's like a new model that's coming out. There's a couple of companies that are trying to do that or currently doing that now, and that will introduce I don't know how many more IDs for us to figure out and leverage in the future.
So, I mean, I'd be interested to see how that scales. You get like £15 over 2 years.
Well, supposedly penetration in APAC is quite high.
Oh, really?
So there's a lot of users out here who are providing their data.
0.000 penny, 1p for 1,000 visits.
I think the guideline that the gentleman I spoke with gave was on average in a month you can make $20 or $50, and then if you kind of scale and they scale, you can make up to $200 a month. So this is all passive income coming into the
$200
consumer.
That reminds me of the news.
Really?
But
Interesting.
I'll download it.
I want that email when we finish this panel. I've got a lot of friends in the Philippines who would help me out.
It's another creepy solution that we'll have to work with. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, really, I think as a takeaway, I mean, now that we have everybody in this room for most of Singapore's key partners, I mean, one of the things Colleen mentioned, it's really key, right? I think if we all can start conversations around unifying our ID, whether it's at least don't make it like 1,500, but can we begin the conversations to look at a couple of IDs? I feel like that's a start. Whether it is the major IAB Digitrust ID Alliance or LiveRamp, anything, right? I mean, if we can come up with that definition, that's a start. And specifically for brands, I mean, one of the things that we need to do is just look at our data and have better control over it, right? Even things like offline, I mean, having control of vending machines. I mean, some might think, that's not going to give us data. But if you have apps interacting with the vending machines, like in China, you have WeChat Pay and everything, and GrabPay is probably on their upswing here. There are multiple ways I can bring in at least mobile device IDs or multiple different IDs that could link our worlds, right? So from a brand perspective, we really need to look at what data we have, but from every other ad tech partner perspective, we have to have a close look at what is the way forward for us. Are we going to live in a siloed, selfish world, or are we going to actually unite the industry? That's going to be the key question for us.
It feels to me this is more of a. It shouldn't be a vendor that kind of comes up with this ID. It should be the sort of IAB Tech Lab or one of those organizations that has a neutral party that we all can use that specific thing, because I think that's important. I mean, I know they're building the consent framework, but the consent framework in Europe is just basically for third-party cookies, right? If Apple decide no more, well, they've already decided. If Google decided you're not going to use as much third-party cookies, because the majority of what programmatic is now is going on to Chrome. They're shifting money from Safari into Chrome because the match rates are better. So let's just say they decided to make it harder or make it easier for consumers to say no third-party tracking, no third-party measurement, etc. Then we have to think about how we do this for a first-party world, because we're going to have to set first-party on the cookies on the page, and that has to be consented. We have to have a framework say, no, I don't want my data used in this way. So you think it's more for an industry body thing?
I think it is. I mean, if you look at what IAB Tech Lab has done in US by working with ID Consortium, it's a fantastic job. I think they are gone in the right direction, whether I don't know how difficult it is in terms of implementation in every single country. That needs to be looked into, but we are heading in the right direction. At least we have some framework which says at least in terms of strategic direction, it's pretty, I think it's really good.
So just going back to the publishers, do you think that this shift is going to basically strengthen the relationships between premium publishers and and brands and agencies? Because obviously we've had a period of time where mid to long tail publishers have benefited from third party cookies and the programmatic ecosystem. But do you think that this move away from the way we trade right now will strengthen the relationships with like premium publishers, and they'll do better at this, and there'll be more direct deals with those publishers?
I definitely do so. I mean, and that reflects the real world, right? I mean, people tend to remember the big publishers for a reason. You know, better brand name, better, you know, trust in them, and that the closer we mirror the real world, definitely the relationships between the premium publishers and the consumers, and of course the advertisers, will grow. Yeah.
I definitely agree as well. I think the challenge there is more so how do they then speak with each other? You know, when you have a lot of disconnect within the publisher ecosystem and within the advertising ecosystem, and you're trying to marry the advertisers and the publishers, you're looking at, you know, match rates, IDs that all don't come together. So that's probably the next challenge, is they do talk, but how do we match them together so that they can actually transact?
So we still come back to the ID.
I think ID, I think ID is the connective tissue between first-party data across different platforms and channels. That ID will still be there. I think once we settle on ID, as Vid said, we will move into more of creative discussion. What are the creative experience we need to build, having connected all these IDs? I think that's the next discussion we should have with every publisher.
Okay, I think we've run out of time, but just one last question was, what would the panel like to see happen now in the next 12 months to kind of to try and hit this head on, like to move us forward in terms of developing this idea? So we'll just start. The four of you can answer the questions.
I mean, I'll focus on APAC. I mean, we just need to have an understanding what is the, you know, at least have a recipe of single IDs and have the entire industry talking here. To me, that's the fundamental thing that I'll be pushing at from Coke, and I'm hoping the rest of the industry can join in as well.
I think for me, if there's an industry body that can actually come and push the wall gardens to open up more, because it's that way rather than having the effort is pretty much lesser. So I would expect that if something of that sort can happen, then we might arrive at a single ID of some shape and form. But it needs to be an industry body. And moving forward, it's more about the effectiveness of the campaigns, because with the IDs, you need to look at what's next.
I love that it happens.
Yeah, I agree with him. I think
It's a wishful question.
It has to be some kind of a neutral body. It cannot be led by one ad tech vendor or one publisher. It has to be maybe a group of ad tech vendors and publishers need to come together to create this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, echoing the same thing. I think it has to be an agnostic party that does this. I probably also add that, you know, maybe we can add a little bit more kind of context to what can we learn from cookie-less worlds, you know? So is that, or opt-in worlds where, like Germany, I believe it's fully opt-in. You know, how do they feel in advertising business? India is a world where they don't really have that cookie footprint. So what have they done creatively in these developing markets with QR codes and, you know, the kind of offline environment to build a digital footprint of a consumer? I think for, you know, a regulatory body to look into that, I think that would probably help us kind of be a bit more creative in how we approach this as a collective team.
Thank you. Round of applause for our panel, please. Thank you.